Hi there, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Kevin Waite, and I'm the author of West of Slavery, The Southern Dream of a Transcontinental Empire. And the book is really about, or really an attempt to understand an overlooked region in the history of American slavery, far southwest. And by the far southwest, I mean primarily California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. Now, beginning in the 1840s and continuing through the Civil War, slaveholders and their allies launched a series of campaigns to extend their power across this region. And they did so through migration, through political patronage networks, the building of infrastructure, diplomacy with foreign powers, and through armed conquest. And I argue that for a time at least, they were remarkably successful, far more successful, in fact, than historians have previously recognized. By the late 1850s, slaveholders had essentially transformed the southwestern quarter of the United States into a political client of the American South. And in the process, white Southerners effectively made slavery into a transcontinental institution. Now, before I go into the particulars, I just wanted to say a few words about how I came to this project and what I'm hoping to achieve with it. My interest in the subject really begins with a map, and it's a map that a lot of us have seen, I think, in our American history school textbooks. Slave states in one color, free states in another. And then you typically get the territories in some sort of neutral beige. But what I'm trying to argue in the book is that there was nothing neutral about the territories of New Mexico or Utah and what would eventually become Arizona, and that California doesn't really deserve its free state blue either. In fact, it would be more accurate to color the entire Southwest a sort of shade of pink, which is actually what you see on the cover of my book. Now, a lot of professional historians have seemingly taken this map and the misleading assumptions that the map rests on at face value. The big seminal books on the coming of the Civil War typically treat the West as more or less an abstraction in debates between Easterners. And these books assume that once California came into the Union as part of the Compromise of 1850 as a free state, the far West was no longer really in play for slaveholders. And to be fair, slaveholders themselves made a really big deal out of the Compromise of 1850. John C. Calhoun, for instance, thought that by losing California to free labor, the South was basically consigned to some sort of perpetual political subordination, that slavery would be hemmed in, and as a result, it would wither and die. But I argue that this moment in 1850 was just the beginning of a new phase in the campaign for slavery's expansion, that California's troubles with slavery had only just begun, and that soon neighboring territories in the Southwest would also get caught up in the thrall of slaveholders. Okay, so how did slaveholders do it? How did they exert their power in far-off places like California and New Mexico? First, I argue, they worked within existing frameworks. At least in California, they didn't really concern themselves with the letter of the law. Now, white Southerners forcibly imported as many as 1,500 enslaved African Americans to California by the mid-1850s, mostly as coerced laborers in the gold diggings. Now, slaveholders brought a number of these black people into California before slavery was technically outlawed there. But even after the California Constitution prohibited slavery, Southerners continued to bring enslaved people into the state. And they did so because they knew that anti-slavery laws required active enforcement, and that authorities in California simply lacked the resources and, in a lot of cases, lacked the political will to emancipate people of color. A letter from one young Kentuckian in California's gold country, I think, sums up this line of thought pretty well. He urged his father to send one of the family's slaves to California in the early 1850s, writing, quote, "Once he gets in, I should like to see anyone get him out." Now, I should add that black chattel slavery never became central to the economy of the American West, which I think is one of the reasons that historians don't usually consider the West a sort of part of America's history of slavery. But the reason that Southern-style plantation slavery never took root in the far West wasn't due to any sort of regional aversion to unfree labor. Ironically, it was due to a surfeit of unfree labor. Slavery in various shapes and forms already existed across much of the region. It's just that the slaves in the West were typically Native American rather than African American. As historians have argued in some excellent new works, the trade in captive American Indians flourished in places like New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. Thousands of indigenous people and their mestizo offspring labored in bondage in mines, in ranchos, and within the domestic spaces of the antebellum Southwest. This is what Andres Resendez calls the other slavery. What my book argues, though, is that white Southerners took a really active interest in this other slavery. They saw it as crucially intertwined with their own type of plantation slavery. And so, when Republican lawmakers attempted to overturn certain forms of labor coercion in the Southwest, Southern slaveholders basically rallied in defense. And within Congress, they actually blocked the passage of any laws against Indian slavery. To them, the other slavery was basically the Western flank in a transcontinental system of unfree labor. Now, one of the remarkable things about slaveholders' influence within the far Southwest was that they actually represented a minority, and a relatively small minority, of the region's total population. They were heavily outnumbered by Hispanos and by white migrants from the Free States. And yet, by the late 1850s, they had passed slave codes in Utah, in New Mexico, and they basically monopolized California's entire congressional delegation. So in a lot of ways, my book is really a study in minority rule. So again, how did they do this? In short, I argue through strict party discipline and by exploiting antebellum patronage networks. Guys like William Gwynn here, a Mississippi planter who became California's senior senator through the 1850s, realized that they could retain control of the state so long as they had friends in all the right places. So Southerners saw to it that the majority of federal positions in places like California were filled with pro-slavery partisans. And they also worked in conjunction with their allies in the South. And they forged, I argue, a transcontinental political network to pass major legislation that favored slaveholding interests in the West, which I think explains why slavery remained legal in the region and why, when major cross-country road networks were built in the 1850s, they usually cut through the lower half of the country. Another way of putting this is that when it came to the far West, slaveholders and their allies acted with a collective purpose that their anti-slavery rivals could rarely match. So that, really briefly, is how slaveholders built their transcontinental sphere of influence. The last chapters of the book deal with the Civil War, with Reconstruction, and what I call the curious afterlife of slavery in the far Southwest, which basically took the form of more than a dozen Confederate monuments in California and in neighboring states. But by this point, you've probably listened to me for long enough, so I'm going to try and wrap things up briefly. And I'll conclude by stressing one of the central lessons of the book, that slavery was national in antebellum America. And in fact, where the slave South ended and where the far West began could be really tough to discern during this period. And therefore, I think we need to completely revise and maybe even overturn some of the most enduring images of the American West as this land of sort of fresh starts and forward progress. For thousands of people in antebellum America, the West was yet another landscape of slavery. Thanks for listening in.